As Canada's ties with the United States fray, Prime Minister Mark Carney moves to strengthen ties with Europe. Carney has signed a strategic defence and security partnership with the European Union, an agreement that comes as Canada rewrites its relationship with the United States and works towards a new trade deal.
What we're going to do, irrespective of the outcome, is we are going to build trading relationships with like-minded partners, reliable partners, partners that are aligned with our values. It begins here. You see the ambition in this partnership and the scope of ambition, and that's the future of trade.
Okay, we have some partners who are aligned with our values here. It's the Power Panel. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister, and here with me in the studio, Vandana Cotter was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. Good to see you all. It's Monday, right? Happy Monday. It's good to see you. Lisa, start with you if we can. There's a long statement here.
Long.
It is. I read it and I was like, these are all the things the G7 didn't say. So the European members in Canada are saying it in this statement. But you can see the strategic intent here. This is the chess game that Mark Carney is trying to play of moving away from the United States and connecting more with Europe. What do you make of the direction and intent of what was unveiled today?
It's a lot. I mean, everything is in there. So I think it's so expansive. There's a couple of things that I zeroed in on that I care a lot about. First of all, in there is LNG, that we're going to work with our European partners on LNG. I give a check mark for that. They mentioned nuclear in there, looking to see whether or not we can progress through a new deal for nuclear. I like that as well. I think that's a really positive thing. I like the fact that we're talking about defense procurement. I think German subs probably make a lot of sense for us. The reality is that we did get squeezed out of some other big discussions around defense. We got squeezed out between the Americans and the Australians. We got squeezed out of another one with respect to Japan and India. So it makes sense that we pivot to Europe. I think the Prime Minister is filling in gaps that have been left, quite frankly, by a previous government. And that's the dancing partner that's left for us. So let's see how it all pans out. But there's stuff in there that warms my cold conservative heart. So that's not a bad thing.
There are so many cold conservatives' hearts being warmed by the Mark Carney era here, Vandana. Like, how are the Liberals feeling about this? I just wonder, what are your thoughts on what we saw here with this? This framework with Europe, because there's still some real meaningful details to come.
Yeah, I mean, this is what Mark Carney has campaigned on, both in leadership and during the campaign, so I think Liberals are not surprised by it. He talked about the fundamental change in the relationship with the United States and how we had to find better alliances, and we've overly relied on the United States. So I think this is a shift that we have been prepared for, Mark Carney has been preparing for. And I saw both your points to the long statement. They talked about a number of other things. They talked about global institutions that they are aligned on. They talked about world crises, so more traditional geopolitical view. And I noticed that President Costas also was talking about shared values and reliability. Mm-hmm. They talked about our similar vision to how we see foreign policy. They talked about Africa. So a number of things that also, on top of what Lisa said, they're united on and have a vision on. So I think we'll see more of that.
There's a reference to climate change in this thing, Jordan, which we did not see at the G7 just a week ago, which is we know why. But what's your high-level takeaway from what we saw today here?
Well, I mean, to me, this just underlined the degree to which the G7 had become a disaster avoidance exercise, or an exercise in sort of managing Trump and the Americans, rather than one where people like-minded countries were coming together around a table to achieve a diversity of sort of foreign policy goals. So you saw that actually coming out in this statement and not in the G7 statement. And, to hear, as we did in the wake of the G7, that, potentially the Americans were looking to water down some of the language around Ukraine, certainly that would be of significant concern to a lot of European allies. So I noted in this statement that there was a good amount of time taken to really underlining that commitment and Canada's commitment. And look, I think, for a very long time, Canada's partnership with Europe has been underutilized on the trade front, on the security front. So this is a very smart place to make an investment. Although it is really interesting, right? Because we're rolling into NATO, of course, this week. And now the discussion is not about 2%, it's about 5%. And so there's a little bit of tension there, too, because even within the alliance, about getting to that 5% is also a little bit about keeping the Americans close, right? So while we see that Prime Minister Carney looking to diversify those relationships, deepen the ties with Europe, the Americans are still there, right? They're still very much a part of that conversation, and I think that that tension it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that 5%, it's a blend just for people at home, like 3.5% on direct military spending and then 1.5% on other things, which could be like port infrastructure and runways and things like this that can help you respond to crises. But it's a lot of money. It's about $160 billion for Canada. But, you know, Lisa, just on this deal with the EU, or this directionally with it, you know, physically, obviously, and geographically, Canada's always going to be in the United States sphere of influence. But sort of, if you listen to them talking today in Brussels and the relaxed body language at this event, intellectually and on a values basis, they're very much Canada and the EU are in the same sphere. At least under Mark Carney was the takeaway I had from that. And they want to work together on a whole bunch of things that they just don't think they can count on the United States to be a reliable partner on, because reliability got said a lot in this conversation.
Or
Okay.
maybe Mark Carney gets to right the wrong of having Brexit while he was the Chancellor of the Bank of England. As you remember, he fought against it. He said it was going to be a disaster for the UK economy and was never really happy with the way that outcome. And here he has the opportunity to go back and say to Europe, okay, well, you lost the UK, but here's Canada, and we're going to join up with you as well. So of course he's going to have relaxed body language. He's getting back to where he thinks the path to prosperity is from his point of view. I would point out one thing though, how refreshing it is to have all these discussions about how much spending we're doing without having a clue where this money is going to be coming from or how much it's going to cost at all with respect to our budget and our fiscal picture. It's an amazing summer of being free from actually having to have any accounting principles in place, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I guess, Vandana, you could look at it that way. But, you know, look, we're going to get a budget September, October. That's the promise. But yes, to Lisa's point, that we are operating without a real clear sense of what the deficit is going to be, what the growth figures are going to be. But this is aspirational spending here, right? And it could be a little bit of back and forth. Could also be selling. It could be buying. But, you know, it is a scaling up of defense capacity on both sides of the Atlantic for self-reliance because of what's happening in the White House.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Canada needs to be protected. So I think really what this is about is investing in Canadian capability and defense spending, what needs to happen, as well as Canada's role in the world. So, I mean, I think for a long time, people have been asking us to increase that 2%. They're here now. But I think, you know, we're seeing, especially looking at the Middle East, there's a number of conflicts we don't know what will happen with Russia and Ukraine. And again, we have volatility in the White House. It makes sense to invest now. Otherwise, we could pay the price for it later. And I think having everything up to date and working, but also ensuring that it helps, you know, spur an industry here in Canada and in Europe. I think that's an opportunity, especially in an economy that's still quite tough.
But, you know, Jordan, when you look at this, right, again, because we all noted how long this communique statement was from the Prime Minister's office and the European partners today, you can see the drift from the United States since Trump by what is in this and what they wouldn't and couldn't talk about at the United States. There's a commitment here to the full implementation of a two-state solution, for example, with Israel and Gaza. There is a reaffirm for support for Moldova, which is, you know, a European country that is neutral in its constitution. It's non-NATO, but it's next if Ukraine falls, right? These are not things you can do in 2025 with the United States at the table. It takes their absence for the presence of these commitments by the other NATO and G7 countries.
Totally, that's right. And I think that that's why these European tables are increasingly going to be important for Canada, because that is, you know, a lot of the things in the past that used to be matters for NATO are now matters for Europe and its allies alone, without the Americans, right? And that's really what we're seeing here. We're seeing the impact of the Americans tearing down the post-World War II global order that they helped set up. And so I think in that sense, you know, it is important that Canada step up military spending. We have been underinvesting for decades, you know, and of course, including under conservative governments. That's not unique. But there is a problem in that it's true that we don't know what the trade-offs are for this spending yet. So, you know, the PBO has been out talking about potentially what those could be, and the reality that the capping the public service that Prime Minister Carney has talked about is not enough to pay for both the tax cuts and the defence spending, that you would either have to look at deficit or really severe cuts in the public service. So we don't know what is coming. We don't know where the trade-off is going to be, and we're not going to know that until the fall. So I think it's interesting because, of course, right now you're seeing pretty broad support from Canadians about the idea of reinvesting in our military, and I think that there's really good reason for that. But right now, the trade-offs also aren't clear. So we're not going to get that full picture until the fall, and I think that we may see a little bit more conversation around that once we know what exactly is being put in the window to pay for this.
You know, Lisa, this kind of brings us back to your point, right, about the lack of a clear fiscal plan, because the Prime Minister has talked about sacrifice, right, as something people are going to need to do without really articulating and quantifying what that sacrifice is. So, you know, the 2% target, if you want to be at the serious tables in the Trump era, you've got to be at least at that level or above. But we don't know what the cost is going to be to the civil service or to programs. And then how do you, the 3.5% and then 5%, that's a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, some of that's industrial policy that can lump into that, but there's going to be some tough choices to be made if Canada is going to stay on this path.
Yeah, and it's an interesting exercise that the Prime Minister and his cabinet have given themselves a bit of runway, to be honest, a little bit of room to build the case as to why we're going to go further into deficit or why these tough choices are going to be made, and then tell us what the tough choices are going to be after a period of time has gone by and everyone has really absorbed the case and agree with the case for more military spending. And that's kind of what the summer and then the last couple of announcements have been about. And it does make sense if that's the plan that you're taking to get there. And I agree with Jordan. I think there will be a reckoning, but I don't know how strongly people are going to feel about the trade-offs because we just don't have a sense of what they are. But you said something very important in your preamble, David, which is industrial policy. Yeah. There's some strong commitments in that very long communique on aligning Canadian industrial policy with European industrial policy. And that is tough. That is not an easy thing to do, considering we've been oriented so long with the United States. So I look forward to having a little bit more understanding of exactly what that means.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And Vandana, you know, when you talk about all of these commitments that are there, these are billions and billions and billions of dollars. So, you know, when Mark Carney in the campaign talked about spend less, invest more, you know, invest a comfort with debt if it's for capital investments or economic growth, not a comfort with debt if it's for civil service and programs. How that breaks down in the budget and then the next budget and stuff, that is going to be that's going to be a very important political moment for this government in its honeymoon phase.
Yeah, and I think it also depends on what is tangible to Canadians. I think people just see concepts of increased defense spending. You hear about jobs, and I think that people need to have confidence. That they have confidence in the economy, they have confidence in decision making. If it's like, you know, look at the U.S. debt, you know, compared to Canada, there's like so much more there, right? Yep. Bigger economy, there's so many other factors. It's not the same, obviously. But I think if people can understand why they're in debt, and I think the questions beforehand, like we're in a deficit, and people can understand why. Right? So if you're in debt because you're paying for this, or if you're in debt because you're paying for that, and it all helps to help protect Canadians and protect the economy, I think people will be more comfortable with it.
Yeah, if you have debt for your mortgage versus just credit card debt, you know, like it's grossly oversimplifying the way government finances work, I get it. But, you know, how this breaks down, though, Jordan, and how where the pain points are as you start seeing how the money moves around, is going to be a challenging thing for
people's perception of value for this spend is going to be really, really important. And I think that this is actually where there's a very significant communications and political challenge for the Carney government. Canada's military procurement process is not known for its speed, efficiency, or cost control. And that's unlikely to change in the immediate future. We're also already seeing some mangled communications around where some of this money is going to go. So Minister McGuinty had been out some weeks ago talking about a 20% raise across the board for Canadian Armed Forces members. Now it's coming out that maybe that's not quite the case. That's going to be the budget increase. But actually what the pay raise is going to be and when that's going to arrive, now that's a bit unclear. And so I think the government is missing some opportunities to clearly communicate some tangible benefits that just make sense to people. And frankly, our armed forces members do need a raise. That's a big problem with retention, right? And so they could be a little bit crisper in terms of how they're communicating the value of some of these things. They're going in and they're going to be hiring more civilian staff. That's good jobs in base communities. That stuff makes a difference in local economies. So there's, procurement, I think, often gets the big headlines, and certainly today it did because of also the potential participation in the contracts with Rearm Europe. But there's also things that are a little bit more basic, a little closer to home, that could be really important for building political support for this in the long run. But they have to get the comms right.
Yeah, I mean, a very big part of the path to 2% is fix the broken gear and pay them a fair wage, or, pay for retention and pay for training so that they can get off being idle and get operationalized and these sorts of things. Like, then the other things can start to take care of themselves. But look, in the couple of minutes we have left, Lisa, so much of this, whether it lives or dies, it depends on what happens with the United States. Kirsten Hillman, the ambassador, has taken on the added role of lead negotiator, sort of matching her with Jameson Greer, the USTR. It's been about a week since they agreed to the 30-day timeline, though the White House or other officials are telling Politico that was more of a Canada push thing rather than a Trump push thing. Whatever it is, I mean, what's your sense a week in if we should be hopeful? Because there's not a lot of detail. It's staying very quiet, which is probably a good thing.
I have no line of sight into what's going on, and I don't know whether or not anyone can actually predict whether the president is going to settle and acquiesce when it comes to some kind of a deal with the United States. I want to mention one thing about the European deal, David, just before we go. And it's this, is that in order to pay for everything that, all the deficits that we're going to be accumulating, eventually the government of Canada is going to have to go out to the bond market. It makes a lot of sense for you to do these kinds of deals with Europeans in order to attract European investors into buying Canadian bonds in order to be able to pay for our deficits going forward. So from that point of view, broadening the universe of who may want to invest in Canada, I think is a smart move by the government to pivot us out of mainly United States kind of focus.
Yeah. Well, Vanda, I wonder, just to sort of kind of get back to the U.S. focus, though, those quotes to Politico this morning that we've got a lot of balls in the air from the U.S. Yeah, you're the United States. Is that just a statement of fact, or should we be worried about that? What do you think?
I think regardless, I think Prime Minister Carney is saying that if you don't make this in 30 days, I have retaliatory tariffs in mind. I think that's his signal that this is not going to be acceptable to go longer, and Canadians are suffering. Like, we talked about this outside, how people have been laid off and people who are worried being off the assembly line, et cetera. These are affecting also small towns, rural communities. This is not necessarily always, it does reciprocate into like downtown Toronto, but it's like the people who are the most at risk get hurt the hardest, right?
Yeah,
and I think he's aware of that.
Windsor, Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, all of these things, right? This is where, they're at the front line of this
Industries
thing.
build towns, There's so many spin-off jobs that come from that. So I think he's much aware of that, which is why I think shortly afterwards he said, if it goes beyond 30 days, we're going to have some more retaliatory tariffs. And I also think this deal with the European Union is also a signal. You don't play ball, we have other alliances that are going to work on that.
Got about 30 seconds, Jordan. It's all yours.
Well, look, I mean, I wish Prime Minister Carney all the luck in the world in the deal with the Americans, but I think there's a couple challenges there for him. And the first is, of course, we don't know what's on the table. We don't know what's being negotiated. Presumably, Canada's prepared to give something up in such an agreement. It would be good for Canadians to know what that might be. And so I think that will be an interesting element to come out of this. And the other thing, to go back to Vandana's point, look, we have about 59,000 people, manufacturing jobs, that have been lost between January and May of this year. So we've seen a lot of speed and urgency from this government on things like the major infrastructure legislation, but we haven't seen a lot of speed and urgency on things like reforming employment insurance. So we need to see that energy from the government as well.
Okay. All right. I loved your energy. We're out of time. Lisa Raitt, Vandana Cotter, Jordan Lakeness, thank you so much.